Welcome back to ajspeller.com. In today's tutorial, we're going to work with benchmark fractions, and let's begin with 1/2. So if we want to change 1/2 into its decimal equivalent, we have to make a division problem. The denominator here becomes our divisor, and our numerator becomes our dividend. And let me add a couple of zeros. Well, 2 can't go into 1, so I place a 0. Also bring up my decimal point, but 2 can go into 10. 2 goes into 10 5 whole times, and 5 times 2 gives us 10. We do our subtraction, and we bring down, and we see that everything is zeros. So we see that 1/2 is the same thing as 5/10. Well, if I want to do 2 halves, well, 2 halves is the same thing as 1/2 plus 1/2. Well, we just said that 1/2 is the same thing as 5/10. So if I write this vertically as 5/10 plus 5/10, I know I need to keep my decimal points lined up. And when I add 5 plus 5 to give me 10, so I write my 0, carry my 1, and then 1 plus nothing gives me 1. So we already knew that 2 over 2 is the same thing as 1, but we're just showing it here. Now, if I want to change these into their percentage, into their equivalent percentages, I just move my decimal point 2 places to the right, or I multiply by 100. So in this case, 1/2 is the same thing as 50%, and of course, 2 halves is the same thing as 1, which is the same thing as 100%. And really quickly, if I wanted to make a quick little model of this, got my rectangle here that's going to represent a whole. And if I split that in half here, we see that this half here is going to be 5/10. This half here is 5/10. Same thing as 50% and 50%. All right, let's move on to thirds. If I have 1/3, well, my denominator becomes my divisor, my numerator, my dividend. Again, I place in my decimal point, add a couple extra zeros. I know that 1 can't be divided by 3. But I do know that 10 can be divided by 3 10 times. 3 times 3 gives me 9. Do my subtraction. 10 minus 9 gives me 1. And then I bring down. And then here you see I'm back at 10 again. So 3 goes into 10 3 times. 3 times 3 gives me 9. And you see that it's starting to repeat. 10 minus 9 gives me 1. If I add a 0, bring it down, we see I'm back at 10, so it'd be the same thing. So what we're going to do here is we're going to place a bar over these numbers here because those numbers are the repeating numbers. So now let's move on to 2/3. Well, 2/3 is going to be 1/3 plus 1/3. So we just said that it is 0.3s repeating, and if I add another 0.3s repeating, well, that's going to come out to be 6s repeating. So 2/3 is 0.6 repeating with the bar over it. And then once we get to 3/3, well, we know that's 1, and we know that there also turns into 100%. And again, if I were to quickly do model, let's choose a different color here. Now I'm going to break it up into 3 pieces. Each one of these pieces here, we know is going to be 0.3 repeating. We put them all together, and we get one whole piece, which is 100%. All right, let's move on to fourths. So I have 1/4. Again, my denominator becomes my divisor. My numerator becomes my dividend. Let's add in some zeros. Bring up my decimal point. Well, 1 divided by 4 is 0, but 10 divided by 4 is 2. 2 times 4 gives me 8. Now I have 10 minus 8 to give me 2. And then I bring down this 0, so now I have 20. Now I'm doing 20 divided by 4 gives me 5. 5 times 4 gives me 20. 20 minus 20 gives me 0, and I see if I bring down another 0, it's going to be insignificant. So here we see that 1/4 is the same thing as 25 hundredths. If we multiply by 100, we know that turns into 25%. Now, if I were to do 2/4, well, 2/4 can be simplified down to 1/2, which we already know is going to be 50% or 5/10. But if we use the adding method that I just showed, so if I do 2/4, that's the same thing as 1/4 plus 1/4. And we just said that a fourth is 25 hundredths. So that's really 25 hundredths plus 25 hundredths. And if we add this up, 25 and 25 give me 50. Show my decimal point, and you see that I am showing 5/10 or 50/100. So we know that's the same thing. Let's move on to 3/4. And just to speed things up, I'm just going to do my addition down here. I've added 2 here, so I'm going to add on a third one. Well, 50 plus 25 gives me 75, and you see I placed in my decimal point. So 3/4 is the same thing as 75/100. And if I multiply by 100, I see that comes out to be 75%. And of course, we know 4/4 is 1, which is also 100%. All right, let's move on now to fifths. All right, I have 1/5 here. My denominator becomes my divisor. My numerator becomes my dividend, and I'm going to add in a few zeros, bring up my decimal point. Well, 1 divided by 5 is 0. 10 divided by 5 is 2. 2 times 5 gives me 10. Do my subtraction. 10 minus 10 is 0. And you notice I'm continuing to bring down zeros. So we know that 1/5 is the same thing as 2/10. But if I multiply by 100, we see that there comes out to be 20%. And we're going to use the same methodology as we did above, where we were adding 25/100 each time. Here we're going to add 2/10 each time. So if I want to do 2/5, well, 2/5 is the same thing as 2/10 plus another 2/10, which turns out to be 4/10 or 40%. If I were to do 3/5, well, I'm already at 4/10 here for 2/5. I just add on another fifth, which is 2/10. So let me add on another 2/10 here. And this here turns into 6/10. And we know that 6/10, if we multiply that by 100, we end up getting 60%. And we see the pattern here. We went from 2 to 4, now to 6. So we know that 4/5 has to be 8/10. 8/10 is 80%. And of course, if we write in 5/5, we know that 5/5 is 1, which is the same thing as 100%. All right, our next benchmark fraction that we're going to use is we're going to go jump to eighths now. So I have 1/8. We know that the denominator becomes our divisor. The numerator becomes our dividend. So I place in a 1 decimal point, and I'm going to place in a few zeros here. And I'm going to place my decimal point here at the top. Let's go ahead and switch the color to try to get some separation here. 1 divided by 8 is 0. 10 divided by 8 is 1. 1 times 8 is 8. 10 minus 8 is 2. Then I bring down my 0. 20 divided by 8 is 2. 2 times 8 is 16. 20 minus 16 is 4. And then I bring down the 0. 40 divided by 8 is 5. 5 times 8 is 40. Do my subtraction, and here I'm at 0. If I were to bring down a number, I'd have to add a 0 and bring it down. We know that's not going to impact the answer. So here we see that 1/8 is the same thing as 125 thousandths. So if I were to do 2/8, well, first off, 2/8 can be simplified down to 1/4. So we know the answer should come out to be 25/100ths based off of the information that we did earlier. If we didn't remember that, again, we know that 2/8 is the same thing as 1/8 plus 1/8. Well, we just said that 1/8 is 125 thousandths. So that means 2/8 would be another 125 thousandths. And then we add these up. 5 and 5 give me 10. 2 and 2 give me 4, plus that 1 to be 5. 1 and 1 give me 2. Bring down my decimal point and my 0. And we see here we have 250 thousandths. But we know this 0 here can be, you don't have to write it. So it is the same thing as 25/100ths, which is what we came up with right here. So now if we continue with 3/8, well, all I'm going to do is add in another 125 thousandths. So when I add that in, I have a 5 here. 5 and 2 give me 7. 2 and 1 give me 3. My decimal point and a 0. So 3/8 is the same thing as 375 thousandths. 4/8 is the same thing as 1/2 if simplified. So we know that this should come out to be 5/10ths. So we're going to add in another 125 thousandths. And I just noticed that I haven't been doing the percentages. We'll go back and do the percentages once we finish. So we add this here all together. So 5 and 5 to give me 10, so I carry the 1. 7 and 2 is 9, plus another 1 makes 10. And then I have the 3, 1, and 1 to give me 5. So here I have 500 thousandths, which is the same thing as 5 tenths if I'm not going to write these two zeros here. So we know that's correct. Moving on to 5 eighths. I'm going to add another 125 thousandths. This math here is pretty simple, so that's going to be 5, 2, 6 at my decimal point. So 625 thousandths for 5 eighths. All right, let's move on to 6 eighths. Well, 6 eighths can be simplified. 2 goes into both of these numbers, so 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 8 divided by 2 is 4. We already know that 3/4 is the same thing as 75 hundredths. But let's go ahead and write that in place. So we're going to add in another 125 thousandths. Well, we have 25 and 25 to give us 50, and then 6 and 1 to give us 7. So here we are at 750 thousandths, which is the same thing as 75 hundredths. On to our next one, which is 7 eighths. We're going to add on another 125 thousandths because we're increased by an eighth. So this here is 5. This here, 5 and 2 gives me 7, and 7 and 1 gives me 8. So here I have 875 thousandths. So let's write this right here. And of course, when we get to 8 eighths, we know that 8 eighths is the same thing as 1. Now let's go back and change each one of these into their percentages. If I multiply this by 100, that moves this decimal place two positions to the right. So 1/8 is the same thing as 12.5%. We see that 2 eighths is the same thing as 25%. 3 eighths, if I move that decimal point 2 places to the right, this turns into 37.5%. Here, this turns into 50% for 4 eighths. Again, we know it's a half. 5 eighths turns into 62.5%. 6 eighths is 3/4, which we already know is 75%. 7 eighths turns into 87.5%. And of course, 8 eighths is the same thing as 100%. Let me scroll back because I think I did I do percentages for the thirds? No, I didn't. So let's do the percentages here for the thirds. For the thirds, if I multiply this by 100, this here turns into 33.3 with the 3 repeating percent. And when I do 2/3, we have the 6's repeating. That there turns into 66.6 repeating percent. All right, so that's those there. Let's get back to the bottom here and let's continue. Those are the eighths, and let's finish up with the tenths. And again, the tenths should be pretty easy. So I have my numerator, which is 1, my denominator of 10. That denominator becomes my divisor. My numerator becomes my dividend. I add a decimal point and some zeros. Bring up my decimal point. 1 divided by 10 is 0. Well, 10 divided by 10 is 1. 1 times 10 gives me 10. I subtract. 10 minus 10 gives me 0. And if you notice, I'm bringing down zeros. So here I am at 1/10. And we know that if I multiply that by 100, 1/10 is 10%. If I move on to 2/10, 2/10 can be simplified down to 1/5. We know that 1/5 was the same thing as 2/10. And we know from what we talked about earlier, 1/10 plus 1/10 is going to give us 2/10. Well, a tenth and a tenth, 0.1 plus 0.1 is going to give us 0.2, which is just what we have, what we derived up here. So 0.2 as a percentage is 20%. And if we continue for 3/10, it's going to be 0.3, and that's going to be 30%. 4/10, which is the same thing as 2/5. Well, if 1/5 is 20%, so 2/5 has to be 40%. Well, if it's 40%, if I write that as a decimal, that has to be 4/10. Now moving on to 5/10. Well, 5/10 can be simplified down to just 1/2. We already know that 1/2 is the same thing as 5/10, or 0.5, which is the same thing as 50%. We move on to 6/10. That can be simplified. Divided by 2. 6 divided by 2 gives me 3. And 10 divided by 2 gives me 5. Well, we just did fifths. We know that 1/5 is 20%. 2/5 is 40%. So it only makes sense that 3/5 has to be 60%. And we know that 60% is the same thing as 6/10 written in decimal format. Moving on to 7/10, we have 0.7, which we know is 70%. Then we have 8/10, which can be simplified. 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 10 divided by 2 is 5. And again, we have fifths. We see that 1/5 is 20%. Where's 2/5 at? I'm sorry, 1/5 is 20%. 2/5 right here is 40%. 3/5 here is 60%. And now we're at 4/5, so that has to be 80%, or 8/10. All right, moving on to 9/10, which we know is 0.9. That there has to be 90%. And last but not least, 10/10 is the same thing as 1, which is the same thing as 100%. Well, here we went through the basics of the benchmark fractions, where we change the fraction into its decimal equivalent, and then from there we multiply that by 100 to figure out what the percentage is. That sums up this video by ajspeller.com, and as always, thank you for watching.